Arizona has quietly hired a war chest and a team of lawyers, and it is getting ready to do something that has not been done in a serious way in living memory. It is preparing, right now, to take the fight over the Colorado River into a courtroom, potentially suing the federal government and possibly other states over who has to give up water as the river dries up. This is not an idle threat muttered in a press conference. The state has set aside millions of dollars, retained one of the most powerful law firms in the world, the kind that defends banks and oil giants in their biggest cases, and openly stated it is ready to file if it does not get a fair deal. And here is why that matters far beyond Arizona. For 100 years, the Colorado River has been governed by a fragile set of agreements that the 7 states honored, however grudgingly, precisely because no one wanted to gamble everything on a judge. If Arizona actually sues, that century-old truce breaks, and the future of water for 40 million people could be decided not by negotiation, but by a court. This is the story of why Arizona is loading its legal weapons, what it is actually fighting about, and why the moment it files could change everything. Before going further, it is worth being precise about where things stand, because the details matter. Arizona has not yet filed a lawsuit. What it has done is prepare for one with unusual seriousness, creating a dedicated legal fund worth millions, hiring elite outside counsel, and stating publicly that it is ready to go to court if it must. Officials have suggested that if a lawsuit comes, it could arrive within months, depending on what the federal government decides. This is a loaded weapon that has not yet been fired, a threat made deliberately visible so everyone at the table understands it is real. Whether it is ever used depends on the choices the other states and the federal government make in the months ahead. To understand how it came to this, you have to understand the deadline the entire river is racing toward. The set of rules that currently governs how the Colorado River is shared, how the reservoirs are operated, and who absorbs shortages was written years ago and is set to expire. For years, the 7 states that share the river have been negotiating what replaces those rules, and they have failed, repeatedly, missing one federally set deadline after another. The core of the deadlock is a bitter split between the two halves of the river. The Lower Basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, sit downstream and have already been absorbing cuts as the reservoirs fall. The Upper Basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, sit upstream where the river is born. And the fight is brutally simple. Who takes the cuts? Because the federal agency that manages the river put forward a set of proposed alternatives, and Arizona looked at every single one of them and saw the same thing. The cuts fell on the Lower Basin. The Upper Basin was asked to give up little or nothing. To Arizona, that was not a compromise. It was a demand for surrender. It helps to understand just how high the tension had already climbed before the lawyers were hired. The negotiations had dragged on for years, past one deadline in the late autumn and another in the depths of winter, with the 7 states unable to bridge the gap between the two basins. Each missed deadline eroded a little more trust, and in the spring, the federal managers took a step that Arizona regarded as something close to a breaking point to protect the upstream reservoir. They announced they would cut the amount of water released downstream, holding more water in the Upper Basin's Great Lake and sending less down to the reservoir that Arizona and its neighbors depend on. Arizona's water agency responded by calling this a failure to comply with the bedrock agreement among the states, language that, to anyone who follows water law, sounded a great deal like the opening notes of a legal complaint. It was a signal that Arizona no longer saw the process as a good faith negotiation among partners, but as a situation in which its fundamental rights were being violated, and in which it might have no choice but to defend those rights in the only venue left. So Arizona did something telling. It stopped just negotiating and started preparing for war. The state set up a multi-million-dollar legal fund and hired a global powerhouse law firm, the sort of firm that handles multi-billion-dollar corporate disputes, specifically to fight over the Colorado River in court. The governor's office made the strategy plain. Arizona would much prefer a negotiated deal that protects its fair share, but it must be ready to defend itself in court if an agreement cannot be reached, or if it believes the fundamental law of the river is being violated. In other words, Arizona is not eager to sue, but it has decided it will no longer be the state that quietly absorbs the deepest cuts while others give up nothing, and it is willing to do the one thing everyone has feared for a century to prevent that outcome. Now, what exactly would Arizona argue in court? This is where the century-old rulebook becomes a weapon. The foundational agreement that divides the river, signed in 1922, contains a specific obligation. It requires the Upper Basin states, the ones upstream, to deliver a set amount of water down to the Lower Basin, measured as a running total of around 75 million acre-feet over every 10-year period, which works out to roughly 7.5 million acre-feet a year on average. On top of that, there is a treaty obligation to deliver water to Mexico, a share of which the Upper Basin is also expected to help cover. Arizona's argument, in essence, is this: those delivery obligations are the bedrock of the entire deal. The Lower Basin only accepted its position downstream because it was promised that a guaranteed volume of water would always be sent to it from above. And Arizona contends that as the drought deepens and the Upper Basin holds back more water to protect its own reservoirs, those guaranteed deliveries are being threatened. If the water that is legally owed does not arrive, Arizona believes it has a powerful legal claim, one grounded in the original compact itself, to force the issue. And Arizona feels uniquely wronged, which is fuel for the whole fight. Decades ago, to secure federal money to build the massive canal that carries river water across the state to Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona agreed to accept the most junior water rights in the Lower Basin. That means when shortages hit, Arizona is legally first in line to be cut, ahead of California and Nevada. And it has been. Arizona has already swallowed the deepest reductions of any state, cuts that have devastated its farmers and forced the state to freeze some new development. So from Arizona's point of view, it has already sacrificed more than anyone, and now the proposed plans would pile even more cuts on top, while the Upper Basin, which it believes is failing to meet its delivery duty, faces no mandatory cuts at all. To Arizona, this is not just unfair. It is a violation of the basic bargain the river was built on, and it is the reason a state that would normally seek compromise is instead sharpening its legal knives. But here is where honesty demands we hear the other side, because the Upper Basin states see this completely differently, and their argument is far from frivolous. The Upper Basin contends that it has never overused its share of the river. Unlike the Lower Basin, which for decades drew its full allocation and more, the Upper Basin states argue they have always lived within their means, using far less than they were technically entitled to. More importantly, they argue that their delivery obligation is not a simple promise to hand over a fixed amount of water no matter what. They contend the original agreement never required them to guarantee a set volume in the face of a historic drought they did not cause. From their perspective, the river is smaller now because of climate and nature, not because of anything they did. And it would be deeply unjust to force the mountain states, who use the least, to drain their own reservoirs and cut their own people simply to keep sending a full allotment downstream to desert cities and farms that grew enormous on water that was overpromised from the start. The Upper Basin believes the shortage should be shared according to the new, drier reality, not according to a rigid reading of a century-old number. There is also a matter of simple geography and fairness that the Upper Basin presses hard. The people upstream point out that they, too, are living through the same drought, that their own communities and farms and reservoirs are suffering, and that they never received the enormous federally built plumbing that let the desert cities downstream boom into metropolises of millions. Why, they ask, should sparsely populated mountain states be forced to curtail their modest use so that sprawling, fast-growing desert cities can continue expanding on water the river never actually had to give? From their vantage point, the Lower Basin spent decades building an economy on overdraft, planting thirsty crops and paving new suburbs across the desert as though the water would never run short, and now that the bill has come due, those downstream states want to send it upstream. The Upper Basin's position is that responsibility for the shortage should track who has been living within their means and who has not, and that a court, if it truly examined the history, might not side as cleanly with Arizona as Arizona hopes. This is what makes the dispute so genuinely uncertain. Both sides can tell a story in which they are the victim and the other is the overreacher. And both stories contain real truth. So you have two sides, each with a serious legal and moral argument, each convinced it is in the right, in a shrinking river that cannot satisfy both. That is precisely the kind of dispute that historically has ended up in one place, the Supreme Court of the United States. Because when two states have a genuine legal conflict with each other, the Constitution routes that fight directly to the nation's highest court, which acts as the referee between states. So if Arizona files, this would likely not be an ordinary lawsuit winding through lower courts for a decade before appeal. It could go straight to the Supreme Court, with Arizona on one side and potentially the federal government and the Upper Basin states named on the other. The other states understand this perfectly, which is why they are not sitting still. Colorado has assembled its own litigation team. California and Nevada have retained their own lawyers, bracing for exactly this kind of showdown. The entire basin is quietly arming itself for a legal war that no one publicly says they want, but that everyone is now preparing to fight. To grasp how serious this legal buildup is, consider who Arizona actually hired. The state did not retain some regional water law boutique. It brought on one of the most formidable litigation firms on the planet, the kind that has represented the largest banks and energy companies in their most consequential, highest stakes battles. Hiring a firm of that caliber sends an unmistakable message. Arizona is treating this as a matter of survival, and it is prepared to spend heavily and fight hard. When a state sets aside millions and hires attorneys of that stature, it is not bluffing about its willingness to litigate. The other states, watching this, understood immediately that the game had changed. And that is precisely why they scrambled to assemble their own legal teams rather than be caught unprepared when the first complaint is filed. This is why the phrase "change everything" is not hyperbole. For 100 years, the genius and the curse of the Colorado River system has been that the states resolve their disputes through negotiation, through deals and compromises and side agreements. Precisely because litigation was seen as too dangerous, everyone understood that if they handed the decision to a court, they would lose control of the outcome. A judge could interpret that century-old compact in ways that no state could predict, potentially rewriting the balance of power on the river in a single ruling. A court could decide, for the first time, exactly what those delivery obligations really mean, whether the Upper Basin must guarantee a fixed amount even in drought, or whether the shortage must be shared. And whatever the court decided would become the new binding law of the river, overturning assumptions that have stood for generations. The reason a lawsuit changes everything is that it takes the future of the river out of the hands of the people who know it best and places it in the hands of judges, with a result no one can control and everyone will have to live with. And the danger runs deeper than just an unpredictable ruling, because litigation is slow and the river is fast. A Supreme Court case over something this complex could take years to resolve, and during all those years, the fundamental question of who gets how much water would hang in legal limbo. Meanwhile, the reservoirs would keep dropping. The drought would not pause to await a verdict. So there is a real risk that the very act of suing, however justified any side feels, could freeze the system in uncertainty at the exact moment it most needs decisive action, leaving everyone, including Arizona, potentially worse off while the lawyers argue and the lake keeps falling. Some experts worry that a legal war could consume the crucial years the basin does not have to spare, turning a water crisis into a legal crisis layered on top of it, with the physical reservoirs emptying beneath both. There is also the question of the federal government's role, which sits at the center of Arizona's aim. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that operates the great dams and manages the river's water, is the entity that put forward the proposed cuts Arizona objects to. And it is the entity that would ultimately impose a plan if the states cannot agree. So when Arizona talks about suing the federal government, it is challenging the federal authority to decide how the shortage is allocated. This raises enormous questions. How much power does a federal agency actually have to force cuts on states? Can it favor one basin over another? Where does federal authority end and states' rights over their own water begin? These are not small legal technicalities. They are foundational questions about who really controls the most important river in the American West, and a lawsuit could force the courts to answer them definitively for the first time. It is worth stepping back to appreciate how remarkable this moment is. For a century, the Colorado River has been held together by a spirit of negotiated cooperation, however tense. The states insulted each other, threatened each other, and drove hard bargains, but they always, in the end, cut a deal, because the alternative was too frightening. The fact that Arizona is now genuinely preparing to abandon that century-long approach, to spend millions retaining elite litigators, and to openly declare it will sue if it must, signals that the old system of cooperation may be reaching its breaking point. The pressures have simply become too great. The river has shrunk too far, the cuts have grown too deep, and the sense of unfairness has become too sharp for at least one state to keep playing by the unwritten rule that you never, ever go to court. When the cost of compromise starts to feel worse than the risk of a lawsuit, the lawsuit becomes inevitable, and that is where Arizona now stands. None of this means catastrophe is certain, and it is important to be clear-eyed rather than alarmist. Arizona has repeatedly said it would prefer a negotiated settlement, and hiring lawyers is, in part, a negotiating tactic. A way of showing the other states and the federal government that it is serious and cannot simply be steamrolled. Sometimes the credible threat of a devastating lawsuit is exactly what forces the parties back to the table to strike a deal they can all live with. It is entirely possible that all this legal preparation ends not in a courtroom, but in a signed agreement, with the threat of litigation having done its work by concentrating everyone's minds. The war chest may turn out to be a tool for peace, but that outcome is not guaranteed, and the fact that it might not happen, that the basin might genuinely tumble into years of litigation, is what makes this such a pivotal and dangerous moment. So what should you take away from Arizona sharpening its legal weapons? First, that the Colorado River crisis has entered a new and more volatile phase, one where the polite fiction of endless negotiation is giving way to the raw reality of a fight over a shrinking resource. Second, that the stakes are genuinely enormous, because a court ruling on the century-old compact could rewrite the rules for 40 million people and reshape the balance between the upstream and downstream states in ways that would last for generations. And third, that there are no clean heroes or villains here. Arizona has a real grievance, having already sacrificed the most while being asked to sacrifice still more. The Upper Basin has a real argument that it should not be punished for a drought it did not create by being forced to guarantee water that no longer exists. Both are right, in their way, and that is precisely why this is so hard, and why a judge may end up being the one to decide. In the end, Arizona's move toward the courtroom is a symptom of a deeper truth this entire river has been circling for years. There is not enough water. The old promises cannot all be kept. Someone, somewhere, has to end up with less than they were told they would have, and no one wants it to be them. For 100 years, the states managed to keep postponing the moment of reckoning through negotiation and clever accounting and the buffer of full reservoirs. Now the reservoirs are nearly empty, the buffer is gone, and the reckoning has arrived. Arizona reaching for its lawyers is what that reckoning looks like when it finally boils over. Whether it ends in a landmark Supreme Court case that rewrites the law of the river, or in a last-minute deal forged in the shadow of that threat, one thing is certain. The era of quiet, gentlemanly compromise on the Colorado River is ending, and whatever comes next, whether struck in a negotiating room or handed down from the bench, will change everything about how the American West divides its most precious and vanishing resource. The lawyers are hired, the fund is full, and the river keeps dropping while everyone decides whether to talk or to sue, and perhaps that is the final, sobering lesson buried in Arizona's turn toward the courtroom. A lawsuit cannot make it rain. A judge cannot order more snow onto the Rocky Mountains or command the reservoirs to refill. Even the most sweeping court victory would do nothing to add a single drop to the river. It would only decide, with the force of law, how the shrinking supply gets divided among the people fighting over it. In that sense, the coming legal battle is not really a solution to the crisis at all. It is a fight over who absorbs the pain of a problem that no courtroom can fix. The water will keep declining whether Arizona wins or loses. The only thing the lawsuit can settle is the distribution of the loss. That is why so many who know this river best view the drift toward litigation with dread rather than hope. Not because Arizona is wrong to defend itself, but because the moment the states stop solving the problem together and start fighting over the wreckage in court, they have, in a way, already lost the larger battle. The river does not care who wins the case. It will keep shrinking, and the West will still have to learn to live on less, whether through a deal it wrote itself or a verdict it never got to choose.